Tonight, we uncover a fear the Vatican never buried, one that still lingers in candlelit halls and sealed vaults. A fear not of devils or heretics, but of something far older, Egyptian magic. Long before the rise of the church, the temples of Egypt held secrets about the soul, time, and the power of spoken words. They called it Heka, the force that shapes reality. It wasn't superstition, it was precision. And it worked. When Christianity spread, this magic didn't vanish. It was absorbed, rewritten, silenced, but not destroyed, buried inside forbidden texts, hidden in chants no one was allowed to hear. Locked in rooms, even cardinals cannot enter. This story is not about fantasy, it is about control. Because if you can speak to the divine without a priest, you don't need a church. If your soul holds power, you cannot be ruled. And that is what they feared. So before you scroll past and forget, ask yourself, what did they erase? And why are they still afraid? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we open the book they tried to erase, and the words are still alive. It was supposed to be locked away forever. But one afternoon, in 1824, a crumbling chest arrived at a museum in France, misfiled, mislabeled, forgotten. Inside, wrapped in decaying linen, was a papyrus older than anything in the museum's archives. At first glance, it looked like any other funerary scroll, but then someone translated the first line, and everything changed. The papyrus didn't speak of gods or burial rites. It spoke of light, of breath, of a force that could shape the world with sound alone. It read more like a spellbook than a religious text, and within days, word had reached Rome. Quietly, urgently, the Vatican dispatched emissaries to the museum. Their mission: acquire the scroll, no matter the cost. By the time the scholars returned to study it again, it was gone. No record, no explanation, just an empty drawer. But why? Why would the church care about an old Egyptian spell? The answer lies in what the scroll described. It told of priests who could command winds with a whisper, of temples built to echo human voices into power, of symbols that weren't just writing, but tools. When spoken correctly, they could pierce the veil between worlds. It was not mythology, it was instruction. And that terrified the Vatican. Because if even a fraction of it was true, then the Egyptians weren't just builders of tombs. They were keepers of something far older, far more dangerous. A kind of knowledge that didn't rely on faith, but on direct experience. You didn't need to believe in a god. You just needed to speak the right words, in the right order, at the right time. The church couldn't allow that. Not then, not now. That scroll has since become a ghost story among archivists. Some say it's hidden beneath the Vatican Library, sealed in a lead case. Others claim copies exist in coded texts smuggled out by monks who couldn't bear to destroy it. A few even believe that fragments of its language were buried inside early Christian prayers, cloaked in Latin, altered just enough to stay hidden. What's certain is this: it should not have been found, and once it was, it vanished again, but not before leaving behind a trail, whispered references in old letters, sketches in forbidden notebooks, and one curious fact that no one can quite explain. After the papyrus disappeared, the Vatican quietly updated the list of banned texts, not with a title, just a catalogue number, one that doesn't exist in any public system. So, the question is no longer whether the papyrus was real, it's whether the church still fears what it might reveal. Because if the ancient Egyptians knew how to speak power into being, then everything we've been told about prayer, ritual, and the divine changes. Maybe the Vatican wasn't protecting us from a hoax. Maybe they were hiding a truth we were never supposed to pronounce. There was a time when people looked up at the stars and saw gods with animal faces, not monsters, not demons, just symbols of power, balance, and mystery. Anubis guarded the dead. Thoth watched over wisdom and writing. Sekhmet could bring both healing and destruction. These were not evil beings. They were forces of nature. They were teachers, protectors, guides. But that all changed when a new story began to take hold in the ancient world, and the people telling it needed to make sure no one looked back. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it faced a problem. Egypt, a land where religion wasn't just belief. It was woven into every wall, every scroll, every heartbeat. Egyptian temples had stood for thousands of years before the first gospel was written. Their gods weren't going away easily. So the early church made a decision. If it couldn't erase Egypt, it would twist it. And that's exactly what happened. Anubis, once the quiet guardian of the dead, became a symbol of darkness. His jackal head suddenly looked demonic. Set, who represented chaos and transformation, was rewritten as evil itself. Even Thoth, the god of knowledge, was reduced to a shadowy figure in old Christian texts. Their statues were broken, their temples were converted, and their names were quietly replaced with things like Satan, Lucifer, and Devil. But it wasn't just name-calling. It was strategy. By labeling these gods as demons, the church gave people a reason to fear them, not question them, not understand them, just fear them, and it worked. Within a few generations, entire mythologies were gone. Sacred symbols became warning signs. Powerful words were left untranslated. The gods were buried, but not forgotten. Because if you look closely, you can still see them. In stained glass windows, in old manuscripts. Even in the hidden corners of cathedrals, the winged figures, the animal masks, the eyes that watch without blinking. They're not Christian, not really. They're echoes of something older. Something the church couldn't completely erase. The question is why they tried so hard in the first place. Maybe it was about control. Egyptian magic taught people that power could come from within, that you could speak to the divine without a priest, that death wasn't an end, but a doorway. Those ideas didn't fit the new system. They made people too free. And freedom is dangerous when you're building an empire of belief. So the gods became demons. Their stories became threats. And their wisdom was locked behind walls, labelled forbidden. But not forever. Today, scholars and seekers are unearthing those old stories, translating lost texts, reclaiming names that were once feared, and the more we learn, the more obvious it becomes. These gods were never evil. They were just in the way. For centuries, the walls of Egypt spoke a language no one could understand. Temples covered in strange symbols, tombs filled with carved animals, birds, eyes, suns. People thought they were decorations or secret codes. But the truth was more dangerous. These symbols were not just pictures, they were words, and the church wanted them to stay silent. Before anyone could read hieroglyphs, the Vatican had already decided they were a threat. In the Middle Ages, church scholars warned that the Egyptian script was the language of sorcerers. That to study it was to invite madness. Some even believed hieroglyphs held spells, that saying them out loud could open doors better left shut. So they banned it, quietly but completely. Any books that tried to decode the symbols were destroyed. Scholars who showed too much interest were excommunicated. Libraries that held Egyptian texts were mysteriously burned. But the real reason behind the fear wasn't magic, it was memory. Hieroglyphs recorded a version of history that didn't match the Bible. Stories of gods who came from the stars, of time before time, of people who lived thousands of years before Adam and Eve. The church couldn't allow those ideas to spread. If hieroglyphs were ever translated, it would challenge everything. So they made sure no one could even try. For hundreds of years, the symbols were treated like a dead language from a lost world, until a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion decided not to listen. In 1822, after years of obsession, he cracked the code using the Rosetta Stone. He realized hieroglyphs weren't just symbols, they were sounds, a full written language. And once he read them, the past began to speak. And what it said shocked everyone. The texts described advanced astronomy, precise calendars, rituals older than the flood, spells for protection, healing, and travel beyond the body. These weren't primitive people. They were scientists, mystics, timekeepers, keepers of a history that predated every Western scripture. And suddenly, all the fear made sense, because the church hadn't been wrong to be worried. If people could read these walls, they might start asking questions, big ones, about where we come from, about who holds the truth, about what was erased to make room for a new religion. After Champollion, hieroglyphs became history, safe to study, neatly placed behind glass. But even now, some translations are kept locked away. Some tombs are sealed off without explanation. And certain passages from ancient texts are missing from the official record. So maybe the question isn't why the church banned hieroglyphs. Maybe the question is what they still don't want us to read. Because every time a wall is translated, a piece of the story comes back. And maybe one day, when enough of the symbols are understood, the full truth will return. Not just about Egypt, but about everything. The Egyptians didn't think words were just sounds. They believed words were alive, that speaking something could shape the world around you, that the right phrase, said at the right time, could heal, destroy, protect, or even raise the dead. Words weren't just communication, they were magic. And that kind of belief made the early church very nervous. In ancient Egypt, there was no real line between prayer and spell. When a priest chanted a name, it wasn't a wish, it was a command. Names themselves had power. The more secret a name was, the stronger it became. They carved these names into tombs and temples to protect the dead from harm. If your name was erased, it was said your soul would vanish forever. But if your name was spoken, especially in a ritual, you could live again. In a way, memory was immortality. Spoken words kept the spirit alive. Now, imagine a religion like that, crossing paths with one that taught salvation came through silence, obedience, and one holy book. It was only a matter of time before there was a clash. The early church believed that only the word of God had real power. Everything else had to be controlled. Magical speech, especially the kind used by Egyptian priests, was seen as dangerous and sinful. It gave people too much access, too much freedom. If someone could speak to the divine without a priest or a church, what was the point of religious authority at all? So the church labelled it heresy. Ancient chants were banned. Coptic prayers that mixed Christian and Egyptian styles were censored or destroyed. The idea that words themselves could have energy was twisted into something evil: witchcraft, blasphemy. Even speaking in certain ways could get you punished or worse. But in secret, the Vatican kept records. They studied ancient Egyptian texts behind locked doors. Some even believed the Church adopted parts of this magic and rebranded it. Latin became the new sacred language. Prayers had to be said in exact patterns. Chanting became ritual. Silence became power. And while the Church warned the public about magical speech, it used those same rhythms behind the altar, because deep down they knew the Egyptians were right. Words change things. Even today, you can feel it. The way a sentence can make your skin tingle. The way a song lyric can stick in your head for days. The way a single name can break a heart or bring someone to life in your memory. It's not superstition. It's connection, it's intention, and it's old. Maybe that's why the Church feared it. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was. The Egyptians believed that when you speak with purpose, you tap into something larger than yourself, something timeless, something sacred. And once you know that, you can never unlearn it. The truth is, words are still magic. They always were. There's a spell in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that sounds like something pulled straight from a church sermon. It speaks of a soul rising, of a body reawakening, of light breaking through darkness. But it wasn't written by Christians. It was carved into tomb walls over 1,000 years before the first gospel was even whispered. And once people started translating it, things got uncomfortable fast. The spell is simple on the surface. It's meant to guide the soul of the dead through the underworld and bring them back into life. But the words are powerful. They talk about being born again, about crossing a threshold of judgment, about standing before a divine force that weighs your heart against truth. And if you pass, you rise, not just spiritually, physically. Your flesh returns. Your breath returns. Your name is called, and you live again in the fields of eternity. Sound familiar? To scholars who read it for the first time, it felt like déjà vu. The parallels to early Christian resurrection stories were too strong to ignore. But that raised a troubling question. How could Egyptian priests have described the resurrection of the dead in such detail long before Christianity ever existed? The Church didn't have a good answer, so for a long time they avoided it. Translations of the Book of the Dead were limited. Some pages were left out of published editions. Museums quietly locked away fragments that referenced rebirth or eternal life. And the resurrection spell, known today as Spell 168, became something you only talked about in whispers. But eventually, the truth got out. It became clear that Egypt had its own version of Judgment Day, that Osiris, the god who died and rose again, shared more than a few traits with another well-known figure, that even the symbolism of crossing the river, being washed clean, and stepping into light had ancient Egyptian roots. The idea of resurrection wasn't born in a cave in Jerusalem. It was carved into stone along the Nile. And that made people uncomfortable. Not because it disproved anything, but because it suggested that Christianity might not have invented the story of rebirth. It may have inherited it, refined it, reframed it for a new audience. But the seed was already there, growing for centuries in temple walls and funerary scrolls. The Church couldn't ban the Book of the Dead outright, but it could downplay it, turn it into myth, pretend it was all metaphor, and for a while that worked. But now we're looking back. we're translating with fresh eyes. And what we're finding is that the resurrection spell doesn't clash with Christian belief. It mirrors it, which leads to a haunting thought. Maybe the story was never about one religion. Maybe the idea of dying and returning, of being judged and reborn, is older than any book. Maybe it's something deep inside us, a truth whispered again and again in different tongues. And Egypt just happened to write it down first. Most people think alchemy is just about turning metal into gold. Old bearded men in dusty rooms, mixing strange powders, hoping to get rich. But in ancient Egypt, alchemy was something much deeper. It wasn't just about gold, it was about the soul. Egyptian priests believed that everything in the universe had layers: physical, mental, spiritual. To change one, you had to understand all three. So when they talked about transforming lead into gold, they weren't only talking about metal, they were talking about people. About turning the heavy, dull parts of a person into something pure, bright, and eternal. It was a kind of inner science. The symbols of alchemy, like the sun, the serpent, and the lotus, weren't just tools. They were stages of transformation. Lead was the beginning, a state of darkness, of ignorance. Gold was the end, a state of light, full awareness, enlightenment. In their rituals, Egyptian mystics used colours, chants, and even specific smells to mimic these stages inside the body. The goal wasn't wealth, it was rebirth. And this made the early church very uncomfortable, because it gave people a path to the divine that didn't need priests. You didn't need to be baptized or go to confession. You just needed to look inward, to refine yourself, to burn away what was false, and become something new. That kind of power was dangerous in the wrong hands, so the church labelled alchemy as pagan, then heretical, then forbidden, but not forgotten. Behind closed doors, Christian mystics quietly studied old Egyptian texts. Some even borrowed from them. The idea of purifying the soul, of going through fire to reach heaven, shows up again and again in Christian writings. But the connection to Egypt was erased, on purpose. Alchemy became a joke in the public eye, a failed science, a fairy tale. But that's not how it started. In fact, the word alchemy itself comes from the Egyptian word kem, meaning black earth, the rich soil of the Nile, the place where life begins. The Greeks added al when they took the knowledge and passed it through the Islamic world. By the time it reached medieval Europe, the original meaning was almost gone, but the secrets were still there, hidden in symbols, disguised in code. Some believe the final goal of Egyptian alchemy was not just to change the soul, but to activate something dormant. A spark inside the body that could awaken higher senses. Vision beyond the ordinary. Energy that could bend reality. And if that sounds like magic, maybe that's the point. Maybe the greatest treasure Egypt offered wasn't gold. It was a process, a map, a way back to yourself. So, the next time you hear about alchemists searching for gold, remember, they weren't just chasing wealth. They were chasing light. They were chasing truth. And the church wasn't afraid they'd succeed in getting rich. They were afraid they'd succeed in waking up. Imagine standing in a candlelit tomb, surrounded by walls covered in ancient symbols. A priest leans over the mummy of someone once powerful. In his hand is a tool carved from sacred stone. He raises it gently and touches the lips of the dead, not to mourn, but to awaken. This was the opening of the mouth, one of the most sacred rituals in ancient Egypt, and one of the most feared by the church. The Egyptians believed death wasn't the end, it was a passage. But to pass through it, you needed your senses, your eyes to see, your ears to hear, your mouth to speak. Without speech, the soul would be lost. It couldn't say its name. It couldn't defend itself in the afterlife. It couldn't call out to the gods. So the priests performed a powerful rite. They restored the voice of the dead. It wasn't a metaphor. They believed it literally worked. The ritual involved chants, incense, special instruments, and sacred texts. It could take hours, sometimes days. The body was treated like a sleeping god. The mouth was opened with precision. And the final words spoken during the rite weren't just prayers, they were commands. Rise, speak, remember. To the Egyptians, it was an act of compassion, of love, of magic. But to the Vatican, it was something else entirely. When early Christian scholars first read about the opening of the mouth, they panicked. The idea of restoring speech after death sounded like necromancy. Speaking with the dead was a huge sin in the eyes of the church. Only God was supposed to have power over life and death. And here was a ritual, thousands of years old, claiming to do just that. So they called it satanic. They said the priests were summoning demons, that the ritual was a doorway to the underworld, that it was proof the Egyptians worshipped false gods. The Vatican banned translations of the ritual. Any European scholar who studied it risked exile. Some early Egyptologists were even accused of heresy for writing about it, and in public sermons, the ritual was held up as an example of pagan darkness. But was that really the reason? Or was it something deeper? Because if the Egyptians could restore a voice, even symbolically, it meant they had knowledge about life, memory, the soul, and it didn't come from Christian doctrine. It came from somewhere older, somewhere the church couldn't control. That's what made it dangerous. Not because it was evil, but because it worked. Today, we understand that the opening of the mouth was part of a larger spiritual science, a way of helping the soul move on, a way of keeping the past alive through spoken word. And maybe that's what the church feared most. That voice is power. And if the dead could speak, maybe they would tell stories no one wanted to hear. Stories about what came before the Bible, before Rome, before silence became sacred. And that, to the Vatican, was the real threat. Long before Latin hymns echoed in cathedrals, before crosses stood over temples, there was a figure with the head of an ibis and the knowledge of the gods. His name was Thoth. To the ancient Egyptians, Thoth wasn't just a god. He was the mind behind magic, the keeper of time, the writer of all spells. And his followers, the priests of Thoth, were trusted with something most people were never meant to see: the raw language of creation. These weren't ordinary priests. They weren't just leading ceremonies or blessing crops. They were scholars, scribes, mystics. They worked in secret chambers, surrounded by scrolls and symbols. Their job was to record divine knowledge and protect it. They believed that words could shape reality, that writing something down the right way could bend the laws of nature. And for centuries, they passed that knowledge from one generation to the next, hidden in layers of symbols, poetry, and song. But then came a new religion, one that didn't like competition. As Christianity rose, the church began to hunt anything that hinted at other powers. And the spells of Thoth were full of them, incantations to call back the dead, maps of the stars that predicted events centuries in advance, rituals that claimed to unlock visions and awaken hidden parts of the mind. To the church, it was all sorcery, heresy, a threat to the authority of one single book. So the purge began. Scrolls were burned. Temples were destroyed. The names of Thoth's priests were scratched off of tomb walls. The church labelled them servants of darkness. Some early Christian writers even claimed Thoth himself was a demon in disguise. But not everything was lost. Some of the priests saw what was coming. They disguised their teachings in Greek, buried texts in desert caves, passed secrets along in whispered riddles. Parts of their wisdom slipped into the writings of later philosophers and mystics. Some even say early alchemists were using fragments of Thoth's teachings without even knowing it. His presence never fully disappeared. It just went underground, and the Vatican knew it. In secret libraries beneath Rome, locked behind iron doors, are documents that mention Thoth by name, spells written in ancient Coptic, star charts that don't match any modern system, pages so old they crumble when touched. The church didn't destroy everything. Some things they kept, maybe to study, maybe to control, but definitely not to share. Because, here's the truth, no one wants to say out loud. The priests of Thoth believed that knowledge was divine, that learning was a form of worship, that curiosity could lead you closer to the gods, and the church feared that. Because if people could discover truth on their own, what would they need priests for? So the priests of Thoth were erased from history, not because they were wrong, but because they remembered too much. Look up at the night sky. To us, it's just stars, distant suns, random lights scattered in the dark. But to the ancient Egyptians, it was a map, a living code. They didn't just look at the stars, they listened to them. They believed the sky spoke in patterns, and one of the oldest and most powerful symbols in that cosmic language was the serpent. In Egyptian temples, you'll find snakes carved into ceilings, slithering through the sky next to constellations and planets. These weren't just decorations, they were instructions. The serpent represented energy, flow, transformation. It moved between worlds, between life and death, earth and sky, physical and spiritual. And when combined with certain stars, that snake became a tool. Egyptian priests used this knowledge in their magical rites. They aligned rituals with specific constellations. They whispered names of stars during healing spells. They built temples to mirror the heavens. Some chambers were designed so that once a year, during a specific celestial event, a beam of starlight would fall on a statue or altar. That moment wasn't just symbolic, it was power. The sky was charging the ritual, and the church didn't like that one bit. See, early Christianity taught that God was separate from the stars, that worshipping the heavens was pagan, dangerous, blasphemous. So any Egyptian texts that talked about astrology, cosmic timing, or serpent symbols were either hidden or destroyed. Star maps were declared heretical, and serpent magic was renamed serpent worship, twisted into something evil. But the truth is, Egyptian serpent and star rituals weren't about worshipping snakes or bowing to planets. They were about tuning in. The priests believed the universe was alive, that everything moved with purpose, and that by understanding those patterns, you could align yourself with something bigger, heal faster, think clearer, even unlock hidden parts of the soul. And that idea, that human beings could access divine power without permission, was terrifying to a church that wanted control. So the Vatican erased it, or tried to, but bits survived. Some of the earliest Christian symbols secretly carried this knowledge. The serpent on the cross, the halo of stars around Mary, even the timing of major holidays, like Christmas, aligned with solstice patterns, shows traces of old star rites, hidden in plain sight. Today, scientists are discovering that ancient Egyptian astronomy was incredibly advanced. They tracked Sirius with such accuracy it still baffles modern researchers. They built entire calendars based on star cycles. But what they didn't write down, what they only passed from priest to priest in ritual, was how those stars made them feel. What they saw during those moments of perfect alignment, what they feared, what they awakened. Maybe some of it was symbolic, maybe some of it was real. But one thing's certain, the Egyptians weren't just watching the stars. They were speaking with them, and the Vatican, sitting under its own dome of painted skies, still isn't ready to admit how much those voices once said. Open a Bible and read the stories. A baby hidden in a basket. A God who dies and returns. Water turned into blood. Plagues of darkness. These are things we think of as purely biblical. But if you go back far enough, past the Latin, past the Greek, past even the Hebrew, you'll find something unexpected. You'll find Egypt. Long before the Bible was written, Egyptian myths were already being told. Stories about gods who walked the earth, about divine births and cosmic floods, about magic words that shaped the world. These weren't fairy tales to them. They were memory, history, instruction. And for thousands of years, these stories were recorded on scrolls, not just on tomb walls or temple pillars, but in delicate books written on papyrus, kept safe in libraries most of the world never saw. Then something changed. As early Christianity spread, it began absorbing parts of older traditions. Some were adapted, some were renamed. Some were rewritten so completely you'd never recognize their roots, unless you knew what to look for. But it's there. Take the story of Horus. He's born from the goddess Isis after she gathers the scattered body of her husband Osiris. He's a child of miraculous birth, protected by divine forces. He grows up to battle darkness and restore order. That story existed over 1,000 years before the Gospels, but the structure feels familiar. Too familiar. Or look at Moses, raised in Egypt, speaking to pharaohs, holding a staff that turns into a serpent, parting waters. These are not just narrative choices, they're fingerprints, echoes of Egyptian magic and myth, reshaped for a new audience. But this wasn't just borrowing, it was a kind of transformation. Egyptian ideas weren't copied word for word. They were folded into a new religion, then used to build its foundation. And as the Bible became more powerful, the original myths had to disappear quietly, carefully, so that no one would ask questions. The church didn't want people comparing texts, didn't want scholars pointing out that the Ten Commandments shared structure with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or that the concept of a final judgment had already been described in the Hall of Ma'at, where the heart of the dead was weighed against a feather. So Egypt was painted as a land of idols, of false gods, of lost souls. Its scrolls were labelled heresy, its stories turned into warnings, and yet the roots remained. Even today, when you look closely at certain parables or psalms, you can feel the rhythm of an older language beneath them, a language shaped by Nile priests and sun temples, a language that once described the soul as eternal and the universe as alive. The Bible didn't come from nowhere. It came through time, through people, through scrolls that once sat in Egyptian hands. And while the church tried to silence the origin, the echoes never fully faded. You just have to know where to listen. Right in the middle of St. Peter's Square, surrounded by marble columns and millions of tourists each year, stands something that doesn't quite belong. It's not a cross. It's not a statue of a saint. It's a 4,000-year-old Egyptian obelisk. And it didn't start its journey in Rome. It came from Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Once, it stood in a temple dedicated to Ra, the sun god. Now, it casts its shadow over the heart of the Vatican. Most people don't even notice it. They walk past it, take selfies near it, maybe wonder why it's there. But the truth is stranger than most would guess. Because this obelisk isn't just decoration, it's a message, a memory, a relic of a time when Egypt held the secrets of the stars and the soul. And the Vatican didn't just steal it, they planted it in their most sacred space, right on top of something hidden. The obelisk arrived in Rome long before Christianity rose to power. Roman emperors brought it back as a trophy, a symbol of conquest. But when Christianity became the dominant religion, instead of tearing it down, the church kept it, moved it, protected it. And then, during the 1500s, something strange happened. They dug under it, they realigned it, they performed a secret ceremony before raising it again, and after that, the square was redesigned around it. Why? Some believe it's just art, a piece of history on display, but others think differently. Obelisks were not just monuments, they were spiritual antennas. In ancient Egypt, they were believed to connect earth to the heavens. Placed at temple entrances, they drew in cosmic energy and divine light. The tip was often covered in gold to catch the sun's rays. They marked sacred geometry, ritual power. So, what happens when you plant one right in the center of Christianity's most powerful location? And what lies beneath it? There are rumors, whispers among historians and researchers, that under the Vatican's obelisk is a sealed vault, that before it was moved, church engineers discovered something buried beneath, not Roman, not Christian, Egyptian. Some say it's a hidden chamber from when Rome still followed ancient rites. Others believe it contains scrolls, maybe even one of the lost books of Thoth. The Vatican has never commented. No one is allowed to excavate the area. All official documents related to the move are vague. What's clear is this: the church went through an enormous effort to keep that obelisk standing, perfectly centered, perfectly aligned. And maybe it's because, deep down, they know what it means. That Christianity didn't erase Egypt. It built on top of it, stone by stone, symbol by symbol, until only the obelisk remained to tell the truth. Standing tall, pointing up, waiting, because even buried under centuries of silence, some memories still rise toward the light. Most people think censorship is something that happens in movies or books, something that only belongs to dictators or governments afraid of bad press. But what if I told you that one of the most powerful bans in history didn't target politics or rebellion? It targeted translation. A quiet decree, buried in church archives, still active today. And its goal was simple: make sure certain Egyptian texts were never read again. It's called the Seal of Silence. Not many people know about it. That's the point. Issued by a pope hundreds of years ago, the order wasn't shouted from the rooftops. It wasn't meant for the public. It was whispered to bishops, scholars, and archivists. A list of forbidden manuscripts, writings that, if translated or copied, could lead to excommunication or worse. And guess what showed up on that list? Egyptian texts. Not just any texts, specific ones. Magical papyri, astronomical scrolls, fragments of the so-called Books of Thoth, writings that spoke of hidden laws of nature, of resurrection rituals, of divine geometry and memory. These weren't just myths to the people who wrote them, they were tools. and to the Vatican, they were threats. The Church had a problem. For centuries, it controlled knowledge. It told people which stories mattered, which ones were holy, and which ones were lies. But the Egyptian scrolls didn't follow the script. They talked about gods who weren't gods anymore, about souls that moved through stargates, about magic that wasn't evil, but divine. And worst of all, some of these ideas echoed Christian doctrine, but from a time long before Christianity existed. So the decision was made: silence it all. At first, this was easy. Most people couldn't read hieroglyphs. The language had been dead for over 1,000 years. But in the 1800s, when scholars like Champollion began to crack the code, alarms went off. Suddenly, dusty papyri weren't just museum pieces, they were readable, and some of them started talking. That's when the seal of silence came back into play. Church-approved translators were given strict guidelines. Some texts were deemed too dangerous to publish in full. Others were buried in footnotes or quietly mislabeled. Independent scholars who pushed too far found their work discredited or mysteriously blocked from publication. Libraries held restricted sections that required special permission to enter, and the seal, still quietly attached to certain documents. Why go to so much effort? Because the Church feared what these texts could unlock. Not monsters or demons, but ideas, questions, possibilities. That maybe our history wasn't as clean as it seemed. That maybe the roots of Christianity weren't only in Jerusalem, but also in Memphis, in Thebes, in the temples of Egypt, where priests once spoke to stars and called it prayer. The seal of silence isn't just about words. It's about control, and as long as it stays in place, the past remains a whisper, one we're still not supposed to hear. In the 1600s, while Europe argued over theology and power, a small group of men boarded a ship bound for Egypt. They wore simple robes, carried crucifixes, and spoke in whispers. Officially, they were missionaries, but their mission wasn't about converting anyone. It was about uncovering something buried in the sands, something the Church had been watching for centuries. These men were Jesuits, and this was the expedition no one was ever supposed to talk about. There are only fragments of the story left. A few letters tucked inside old Vatican archives, a shipping manifest with erased names, and a single report written in code, sealed, and never published. But from what survives, a picture begins to form. The Jesuits had a secret objective. They weren't heading to the pyramids or the tourist spots. They were going deep into Upper Egypt, places that didn't appear on most maps, places where locals still whispered about gods that weren't supposed to exist anymore. These priests had maps older than the Renaissance. They had sketches of ruined temples no European had supposedly ever seen. And most importantly, they had orders. Find the lost library, not the Library of Alexandria. That was long gone, burned, looted, erased. But legend said that before it was destroyed, certain texts had been smuggled out, carried by priests into the desert. Hidden in underground chambers, guarded by riddles and symbols. Books not just of philosophy or astronomy, but of magic, of resurrection, of ancient rites so powerful, even speaking them could change something in you. The Jesuits believed the vault was real, and some say they found it. There are clues. One journal entry talks about a staircase beneath a collapsed temple. Another mentions blackened stone walls etched with carvings no one could translate. And then there's the gap. A full month of missing entries. When the journal resumes, the tone is different. fearful, urgent. One phrase repeats again and again. We must not bring it back. Whatever they saw, whatever they read, it changed them. Not long after, they abandoned the mission. Some returned to Europe, but others disappeared completely. The Church officially denied the expedition ever happened. The few documents that remained were locked away. When scholars later tried to trace the journey, they hit dead ends. Burned records, missing maps, vanished names. Why? Because the Jesuits had seen something the Vatican couldn't control. Knowledge that didn't bow to doctrine. Symbols that matched visions in early Christian texts. Spells that mirrored sacraments. A blueprint for the soul that didn't require a church. So the expedition was erased. Not forgotten, just hidden. But every now and then, a letter surfaces. A coded map appears in an auction house. A strange symbol shows up in a Jesuit seminary. And people start asking again, what did they really find out there? And why is the silence louder than any sermon? Tucked away in one of the darker corners of the Vatican library is a scroll that doesn't belong. It's not a Bible, it's not Latin, and it's not supposed to exist. It's drawn on faded parchment, covered in symbols that even some scholars can't fully explain. But what makes it strange isn't just what's on it, it's what's not. This map shows Egypt, but not the Egypt we know, not the Egypt you'll see on Google Earth. This is a map of temples that don't appear on any modern record, and the question is why? The scroll first came to light in the 1800s, buried inside a sealed Jesuit archive. It was found alongside a journal written in a ciphered dialect of Coptic and Latin. Most dismissed it as a curiosity, a fake maybe, but one man, a monk who specialised in ancient cartography, began to study it. What he found sent ripples through the inner circle of the church. The landmarks were familiar at first. The Nile, the Valley of the Kings, even the pyramids, although drawn smaller than expected. But then, as the map continued south, things changed. Entire temple complexes were labelled with names that matched no known site. There were markers where modern ruins do not exist, arrows pointing to locations beneath sand dunes. And most strange of all, certain spots were circled in red ink with a single word scrawled in the margin, silere, Latin, for be silent. Why would the church keep a map like this? One theory is that these weren't just temples, they were sanctuaries, places where ancient Egyptian priests conducted rituals so secret that even the pharaohs didn't speak of them openly. These weren't tourist sites or tombs, they were repositories. For scrolls, for knowledge, for spells that dealt with the movement of stars and the architecture of the soul. The kind of things early Christian scribes called dangerous. The red circles seem to confirm it. Every circled location corresponds with an ancient tale or fragment found in forbidden texts. A temple of mirrors said to reflect divine truth. A buried hall that supposedly housed the body of a god-king who never died. A sanctuary said to have been built with sound, not stone. When modern archaeologists attempted to visit some of the locations, they found nothing. Empty desert, flat land. But that didn't stop the rumours. Satellite imaging later revealed strange patterns beneath the surface. Foundations, grid shapes, things too precise to be natural. But when permission was requested to excavate, doors closed. The Egyptian government denied access. Vatican scholars offered no help. And the map? It vanished back into the archives. Except copies were made. Illegally. Quietly. And now, a few researchers are following those paths. Not to dig, but to listen, to feel, to stand, where memory still lingers in stone and sand. Because maybe the map isn't just about finding lost temples. Maybe it's about finding what the church was afraid they would teach. It started with a collapsed tunnel. A minor earthquake in Rome had opened a crack in one of the lesser-known catacombs beneath the city. Workers were sent to assess the damage. What they found wasn't just broken stone. It was a sealed chamber, one that no record showed, hidden behind layers of dirt and forgotten prayers. And inside that chamber was something that shouldn't have been there, a sarcophagus, decorated in gold leaf, carved with symbols that weren't Latin or Christian, they were Egyptian. The Vatican sealed the site within hours. What happened next was kept off the books. No official statement, no press release, but some details leaked, enough to piece together the story. The sarcophagus was opened under supervision. Inside was a body, perfectly preserved, mummified, wrapped in linens that bore the mark of royalty. Whoever he was, this wasn't some stolen corpse from a museum or black market. He had been placed there deliberately, buried beneath Rome, just a few steps from the oldest Christian crypts. The body showed signs of extreme care, the kind of preparation reserved for pharaohs. Organs removed, resin used, amulets placed over the chest. But the strange part wasn't just the condition of the body, it was the objects buried with it. A scroll case containing fragments of hieratic script, a dagger inlaid with lapis lazuli and inscribed with prayers to Thoth, and a small statue of Osiris, god of the dead, clutched in the mummy's hands. Why would a pharaoh be buried beneath a Christian city? One theory is that he wasn't buried there at all, that he was hidden, smuggled, taken from Egypt during one of the early Crusades or Jesuit missions and placed beneath the church's feet. Not as a trophy, but as a secret. Some think he was a priest, not a king, a keeper of forbidden rites, a man who knew spells that blurred the line between resurrection and reincarnation, and the scroll fragments seem to support that. They mention a bridge of breath and a gate of stars beneath the black sun. Phrases that match language found in the Book of the Dead and, oddly enough, in a few early Christian texts that were later removed from the Bible. Others believe the burial was part of a pact, a deal struck between early church fathers and rogue Egyptian priests, a trade of silence for power, a merging of symbols. After all, many of the early catacombs use imagery that looks suspiciously Egyptian, winged figures, eyes watching from behind, sun discs, snakes forming halos. But if that's true, then why hide the body? Because proof is dangerous. Proof that Egyptian rites didn't just survive, they were honoured, hidden beneath the seat of Christianity itself. That magic and resurrection were not opposites, but overlapping ideas. And that maybe, just maybe, the Vatican's greatest fear wasn't the dead man himself. It was what he might remember. In dusty monasteries, lit by candlelight, monks copied scripture by hand, hour after hour, word after word. Every letter had to be perfect. A single mistake meant starting over. Most people imagine these monks as quiet, obedient men, just preserving the word of God. But some of them were doing something else. Hidden between the lines of Psalms and Gospels, they were slipping in magic. Spells, symbols, forbidden names, not on the surface, but in the margins, in invisible ink, in code. They were writing 2 books at once. Scholars call them glosses, tiny notes scribbled on the edges of manuscripts. Most were innocent. A translation, a comment, but a few were strange. They referenced Egyptian gods by name. They described rituals for summoning angels. They hinted at secret knowledge passed down from the temples of Thoth. One margin even included a spell from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, rewritten using Christian terms. The prayer looked like it was about Jesus, but the structure and symbols matched a much older rite. Why would monks do this? Because not all of them agreed with the church. Some had studied in places like Alexandria. Some had access to ancient texts before they were burned. They believed knowledge was sacred, no matter where it came from. And when they were ordered to destroy it, they chose to hide it instead. They disguised Egyptian spells as Christian prayers. They buried magical formulas inside Bible verses. They encoded names of old gods inside Latin acrostics. On the surface, everything looked holy, but between the letters, secrets waited. One manuscript from the 9th century contains a prayer to the light bringer who passes through 12 gates. That phrase doesn't exist in the Bible, but it does appear in Egyptian funerary texts. Another scroll includes a diagram that looks like a Christian mandala, but it's actually a star map based on the movements of Sirius and Orion, two of the most important symbols in ancient Egyptian astronomy. Some monks even used invisible ink. Recipes for it were passed in whispers. Lemon juice, vinegar, sometimes blood. The words could only be revealed with heat. Others used mirror writing or coded alphabets. To a normal reader, the page looked harmless, but to the trained eye, it was a vault of knowledge. The church eventually caught on. Certain books were seized, monasteries were raided, monks accused of heresy were silenced. Some were burned, others simply vanished. The remaining manuscripts were either hidden in locked vaults or destroyed completely, but not all of them. A few survived, smuggled out, passed down, now sitting in private collections and university archives, waiting for someone who can read between the lines. Because in those margins lies a different kind of history, one the church hoped would disappear. A history where magic and faith were not enemies, where the same hands that praised Christ also whispered spells to the stars, and where silence wasn't ignorance, it was protection. Most people have never heard of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. It sounds like something out of a Harry Potter book, but it was real. It was the church's official list of forbidden books. Pages you weren't allowed to read, words you weren't allowed to think. For over 400 years, this list was updated, expanded, and quietly enforced, and buried inside it were Egyptian texts, ancient scrolls, translations of spells, manuscripts that had survived fire and sand, only to be silenced by ink. Some of these texts had nothing to do with Satan. They weren't curses or evil rituals. They were prayers to the sun, instructions for healing the soul, maps of the afterlife written thousands of years before the Bible. But the church didn't see wisdom. They saw competition. These books didn't support the Christian timeline. They didn't tell the story the Vatican wanted told, so they were added to the index. One of the most famous was the Book of Thoth, a collection of magical teachings said to unlock divine language. It wasn't just banned, it was hunted. Copies were tracked down and destroyed. Even references to it in other books were censored, but fragments survived, hidden in museum basements, smuggled into private libraries, written in scripts that only a few could understand. And on every copy, a warning was scribbled by hand. Do not translate, do not share, do not awaken. Another banned text was the ritual of coming forth by day. Today, we call it the Book of the Dead. It was one of the most important Egyptian guides to the afterlife, and parts of it looked familiar. Too familiar. It talked about judgment, about the weighing of the heart, about a soul standing before a panel of divine judges. It echoed scenes found later in Revelation, in some cases, word for word. That made the church nervous, so it was added to the index. Then there were the medical papyri, texts that blended herbal knowledge with magical chants. To the Egyptians, healing was spiritual. You treated the body and the soul together. But the church had its own version of medicine, one that left no room for spells. These papyri were labelled heretical, and even though they contained life-saving knowledge, they were locked away. The index wasn't just about banning books, it was about erasing stories, silencing voices, reshaping history until it fit inside one narrative. A clean one, a safe one, but here's the twist. Even after the index was officially abolished in the 1960s, some texts were never removed. They stayed forbidden, not because of evil, but because of what they might reveal. So today, those Egyptian books still sit in the shadows, not because they failed, but because they survived. And somewhere, behind Vatican walls, they remain sealed, not just from view, but from memory, because once you read them, the story changes, and maybe that's the real magic the church still fears. He was called the Thrice Great, Hermes Trismegistus, a name that echoed through temples, scrolls, and secret societies. To some, he was a man, to others, a god, or maybe both. The Greeks linked him to Hermes. The Egyptians knew him as Thoth, the god of writing, magic, and hidden knowledge. But no matter what name he went by, one thing stayed the same. He was the messenger of the divine, and his words were dangerous. That's why the Vatican stepped in. The Hermetic texts, written in his name, were once seen as sacred philosophy. They spoke of the stars, the soul, and the secrets of the universe. They taught that everything is connected, that the divine lives within all things, that true knowledge comes from looking inward. Sound familiar? It should, because some of these ideas showed up centuries later in early Christian writings, only reworded, rebranded, and stripped of their Egyptian roots. When Renaissance scholars started digging into old libraries, they rediscovered these texts. People like Marsilio Ficino translated the Hermetica into Latin and treated them like scripture. For a moment, the church didn't panic. At first, they even supported the translations. They thought the Hermetica came from the time of Moses, maybe even earlier. That made them ancient, respectable, safe, until someone realized the truth. These weren't texts written after the Bible. They were written before, long before. And worse, they weren't Greek in origin. They were Egyptian. The prayers, the cosmology, the language, it all pointed south, to temples along the Nile, to priesthoods that had existed before the church ever dreamed of Rome. That changed everything. Suddenly, these books weren't harmless. They were competition. So the Vatican changed its mind. The campaign began quietly. Scholars who supported Hermetic ideas were labelled heretics. Some were excommunicated. Others were forced to correct their work. The Egyptian origins of the texts were downplayed. New translations altered key phrases. Instead of referring to the divine as both male and female, newer versions made it strictly masculine. Instead of speaking of reincarnation or the unity of all life, the texts were edited to sound more like Christian doctrine. Then came the final step. They started to say Hermes never existed, that he was just a myth, a composite figure, a mistake in history. Convenient, right? Erase the messenger, and the message loses its power. The Hermetic texts were pushed to the margins of theology, not banned exactly, but buried, taught as curiosities. Footnotes, nothing more. But the truth never really went away. The real Hermes, the Egyptian Thoth, still stands at the centre of the Hermetica, and his message is still there, if you know how to read it. It's written in the stars, in the geometry of temples, in the whispers of ancient spells. And maybe that's why the Vatican worked so hard to distort it, because the Hermetica doesn't just challenge their theology, it challenges their timeline, their authority, their claim to truth. And in a world built on control, that might be the biggest threat of all. Somewhere deep in the Egyptian desert, in the ruins of an old monastery, a scroll was found. It was brittle, half-burned, written in Coptic, the language of early Egyptian Christians. But what was on it didn't match anything in the Bible. It told the story of a priest, not just any priest, a sorcerer priest, one who walked between two worlds. He spoke the words of Christ and the spells of Thoth. He healed the sick, not with prayer alone, but with chants passed down from the old temples. He called upon angels and gods. He believed they were the same. The church called it blasphemy. They named it the Sorcerer's Gospel. Not officially. That name came from whispers, from the few scholars who had seen fragments before they vanished. It wasn't just a story, it was a threat, because it showed a version of early Christianity that didn't erase Egypt, it embraced it. The priest didn't see paganism, he saw layers, echoes of the same divine message spoken in different tongues. He wrote that the Nile and the Jordan flowed from the same source, that Osiris and Christ walked similar paths, death, resurrection, eternal life. He described rituals that blended communion with ancient offerings. He taught his followers to meditate like the old scribes of Thoth, to enter states of divine dreaming, to speak words not just to God, but with God. That power, he believed, came from knowing both traditions, and that's why it had to disappear. The Vatican had spent centuries drawing a line. Egypt was the past, Christianity was the future. One had to die for the other to live, but this gospel erased that line. It suggested they were never separate to begin with, that the first Christians didn't destroy Egyptian magic. They used it, built on it, hid it in plain sight. And that would mean everything the church claimed about the one true faith wasn't so clean or so original. So the scroll was taken. Some say it was bought by Vatican agents pretending to be collectors. Others say it was seized during an archaeological raid. Either way, it vanished. The monastery where it was found was mysteriously burned down a year later. The monks were never heard from again. The Sorcerer's Gospel became a myth, a footnote, a rumour spoken in academic circles with raised eyebrows and lowered voices. But pieces remain. A quote found scribbled in the margins of another banned text. A verse that appears almost word for word in a Gnostic gospel. Symbols that show up in both Egyptian tombs and Christian catacombs. They point to something real. A hidden gospel. A forbidden fusion. A message that was never meant to survive, but did anyway. And maybe that's why the church still fears it. Because if the Sorcerer's Gospel ever came to light, it wouldn't just rewrite history. It would reveal a version of Christianity that's older, stranger, and far more magical than we've ever been told. There's a museum in the Vatican you'll never find on any map. No signs point to it. No tourists line up outside. It's not part of the official tour. In fact, most people inside the Vatican don't even know it exists. They call it the secret museum. But the truth is, it's not a museum at all. It's a vault, a prison for ideas, a place where certain objects are kept not to be displayed, but to be contained. Only popes and exorcists are allowed inside. Behind thick iron doors, past layers of guards and silence, are rooms filled with things that don't belong in any church. Amulets with hieroglyphs that glow faintly under candlelight, scrolls wrapped in black cloth, rumoured to curse anyone who reads them aloud. Wooden statues of gods with animal heads, their faces worn smooth from centuries of worship. Some say there's even a mirror that shows visions in a language no one can speak anymore. Why keep these things? Why not destroy them? Because even the Vatican fears what they don't understand. Some items are too powerful to be burned. Others are too sacred or too dangerous. They come from a world the Church has tried to erase for centuries. A world of ancient Egyptian magic, rituals older than the Bible, beliefs that speak of gods who walked with men, and words that could shape reality. The popes who saw these objects didn't laugh. They trembled. One artifact is whispered about more than any other. A black stone tablet, smooth as glass, covered in golden writing that pulses under moonlight. It's said to be a map, not of land, but of time. A timeline that doesn't match the one we know, with missing years, hidden rulers, alternate truths. The few who've read it left the church, or went mad. Some became exorcists. Others vanished completely. There's also a ring locked in a lead box, passed secretly from one pope to the next. No one wears it. It's not a symbol of power, it's a reminder. Engraved with a serpent devouring the sun, it once belonged to a priest of Thoth. The legend goes that if it's ever returned to its original temple, the cycle begins again. A new era of magic. A new awakening. That's why it stays hidden. So the secret museum stays shut. No cameras, no catalogues, just a handful of guardians sworn to protect the church from the things it can't explain. They say, knowledge is power, but in this place, knowledge is fear. Because if the world ever saw what's inside those vaults, it might start asking questions, hard questions, like who really wrote the first prayers, or what the early popes were trying so hard to bury. And maybe that's the biggest secret of all, that the church doesn't just guard the holy, it guards the haunted, the ancient, the magical, the truths that could unravel everything. In the deepest part of the Vatican Library, there's a document locked inside a box made of cedar and silver. It's not a book, it's a warning. The seal on it is cracked, but the writing inside is still clear. It mentions a name that was once erased from every temple wall in Egypt, Akhenaten, the heretic king, the pharaoh who dared to worship one god while the priests still bowed to many. But the strangest part isn't his religion, it's what followed him. A sickness. The document describes a pattern. Every time his name is spoken too often, something returns. A wave of strange deaths. People collapsing without cause. Skin turning pale. Eyes clouding over. The church doesn't call it a curse, but it's there in the margins. Written in Latin so old, even the translators struggle with it. It talks about the shadow of the sun disk and the breath that steals the soul. It even references outbreaks in the 14th century in Italy, in Spain, and much earlier, before the Black Death had a name. But why would the Vatican care about an Egyptian pharaoh? Because Akhenaten wasn't just a ruler. He was something else, something that didn't fit into the church's version of history. He rewrote Egypt's gods. He shut down temples. He claimed visions from a radiant being in the sky. Some said it was the sun, others weren't so sure. There are texts buried in the Vatican that suggest he spoke to something not of this world, something older than any god. That terrified the early popes. When explorers first started bringing back artifacts in the 1800s, one of them found a sealed box near the ruins of Akhetaten, the lost city. Inside was a tablet. It was covered in strange writing, not quite hieroglyphs, not quite anything else. The man who opened it died 3 days later. Fever, bleeding. His assistants went blind. The box was sent to Rome. Quietly. No records. No press. The Vatican took it, locked it away, and wrote the warning. Do not speak his name too many times. Do not read the tablet aloud. Do not display his image under sunlight. 3 rules, hidden in an internal memo. Only a few were allowed to see it, mostly exorcists. Some say it's not just a sickness, that the plague is something spiritual, that Akhenaten's god wasn't just a symbol, it was a presence, and it still listens. People who research him too deeply tend to stop, or vanish. One priest was found in Cairo, with his notes burned and his tongue missing. Another locked himself in a monastery and refused to speak again. He only wrote one sentence over and over. He returns when we forget why we buried him. So maybe it's not just superstition. Maybe there's a reason his face was chiseled off statues. Maybe that curse wasn't just Egyptian. Maybe it still moves in silence, waiting for someone to wake it up. And maybe the Vatican knows that time is getting close. There's a papyrus that's barely ever spoken of. No pictures of it online, no catalogue entry in any museum. But it exists, folded and faded, kept in a glass case deep inside Vatican territory. The people who've seen it call it the Scroll of Light, not because it glows, but because of what it describes. A kind of energy that ancient Egyptians believed came straight from the gods, not metaphor, not poetry, a real force, a divine source that lived in all things. That could be felt, directed, even shared. The scroll doesn't just talk about worship, it talks about activation. The text describes rituals meant to open the vessel of light within, not just prayer, but posture, tone, geometry, sound frequencies that unlock the body's ability to draw in this sacred energy. One line says, "He who speaks the word with truth becomes the Son made flesh." That line alone made Vatican scholars uneasy. Too close, too familiar, too much like the idea of divine incarnation, of God becoming man. But this was written 1,000 years before anyone wrote about Jesus. And that's where the trouble begins. Because if this scroll is real, it means divine energy wasn't seen as exclusive. It wasn't limited to one figure or one moment in history. It was accessible, universal. The Egyptians believed that every human carried a piece of that light, that through discipline and knowledge, anyone could awaken it. Not through faith alone, but through action, through initiation, the kind the Church has never taught. The scroll even outlines stages. First the awakening, then the cleansing, then the ascent. It's written like a manual, a guide, not for priests, but for individuals. There are diagrams too. Human forms surrounded by waves of light. Shapes drawn in sacred patterns. Circles within circles meant to represent movement of this force through the body and sky. Some of the glyphs match symbols found later in Hermetic texts. Others appear in early alchemical manuscripts. But this is older, purer, direct. And that's what makes it dangerous. The Church's theology depends on a different kind of model. One where light comes from above, from heaven, through a Saviour, through a sacrament. You receive it, you do not become it. But the scroll of light flips that idea. It says the temple is the self, the altar is the heart. The light is already here, you just forgot how to use it. That's why the scroll was hidden. Not destroyed, studied, feared, but never released. Because if people began to believe they didn't need an institution to access the divine, what would happen to the institution? If you are the light, then what role does the church play? That's the question buried under every Vatican seal on that case. Not just, is this true, but what if everyone knew? In the late 1800s, deep within the walls of the Vatican, there was a man whose name almost no one remembers. Not a cardinal, not a pope, just a quiet cleric with a quiet job. His task was simple on paper: to catalogue and preserve a special collection of items that didn't belong on display. They called him the Keeper of the Vault. And the vault he kept wasn't just locked, it was sealed, buried beneath stone, lined with gold leaf and guarded by silence. The items inside weren't ordinary relics, no crosses, no bones of saints. These were older, stranger, Egyptian, a ring carved with an image of a falcon that never aged, a vial of oil said to burn without flame, a stone etched with spells written in both Coptic and hieroglyphs, and at the centre of it all, a broken mirror rumoured to have belonged to a temple priestess of Isis. They said, when light hit it just right, it showed more than your reflection. The keeper, Father Luca Verno, took the job seriously. He never left the Vatican, never missed a record, never questioned orders. Until one night, something changed. His journal, later recovered from a drawer in his quarters, told a different story than the reports. It spoke of whispers coming from behind the vault door, of dreams filled with symbols he didn't understand, of a presence that seemed to grow stronger every time he opened the chamber. He began to write letters. Not to anyone official, just to himself. Letters filled with questions. Why were these items kept instead of destroyed? Why did some of them appear to move when no one was watching? Why did he feel like something inside the vault wasn't asleep but waiting? The final journal entry is only one sentence long. It followed me home. 2 days later, he was found dead in his chambers. No wounds, no sign of violence, just a strange symbol drawn in ash on the floor. No one could identify it. Not even the church's best experts in ancient languages. The room was sealed, his body was buried quietly, and the vault reassigned, guarded by 2 exorcists, its contents inventoried again. But not all items remained. A few had vanished. The Vatican never released an official statement. They didn't even acknowledge that Father Luca had a unique role. But among the staff, stories spread. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he saw something he wasn't supposed to. A few believed he tried to use one of the objects. Or worse, one of them used him. Whatever happened, it changed the rules. From that point on, no one was allowed in the vault alone. The keeper had become the warning, and the vault remained what it always was: a place of forgotten gods and dangerous memory, a wound sealed with silence. Somewhere in the lower levels of the Vatican's archival maze, there's a shelf that doesn't appear on any official map. It's not marked with a name, just a series of numbers and letters that don't follow any known system. Hidden there are a few reels of audio tape, old, dusty, labelled only with the word Coptic, no other notes, no translation. Just that one word and a warning scribbled on the back of one box in faded ink. Do not play in solitude. But someone did. Back in the 1950s, a young Jesuit scholar named Matteo Morelli was helping digitize portions of the Vatican's archive. He was curious, fluent in Greek, learning Coptic, and fascinated by the mystery of early Christian Egypt. One afternoon, while sorting reels, he came across the tapes. He didn't ask permission, he just played one. According to his personal notes, which were later found locked in his desk, what came through the speakers wasn't music. It wasn't prayer. It was something else. He described it as a low, rhythmic chant that didn't follow any melody, just a pattern, like breathing, like waves. He said it felt like the sound was speaking directly to the inside of his mind. Not the words, the rhythm. He only listened for 5 minutes. That night, he woke up screaming in a language no one around him understood, a language with clicks and tones and breathless pauses. His roommate said the room felt cold, the kind of cold that presses down on your bones. Morelli didn't remember speaking, but over the next few days, he began to change. He stopped eating, slept only in short bursts, wrote compulsively in a mix of Latin and Coptic with symbols no one could identify. He claimed the voice on the tape had shown him a path of light through darkness, that it was older than Scripture, older than Egypt. Eventually, the Vatican stepped in. His notes were confiscated, the reels were returned to storage and sealed with a new code. Morelli was sent away. Officially, for extended sabbatical. Unofficially, no one knows what happened to him. Some archivists whisper that the recordings were made in the early 20th century at a monastery in Upper Egypt, that the monks there practiced a form of sound magic passed down secretly for centuries. Chants designed not just to praise, but to unlock, to stir something in the listener's subconscious. Frequencies that interact with memory, emotion, thought. And that's why the Vatican kept them. Not because they were holy, but because they worked. Even now, no one plays those reels. They sit in silence, surrounded by warnings, wrapped in layers of protective cloth, because the Church knows some words were meant to be read. Others meant to be spoken, but a few were meant to be heard. And once you hear them, they never quite leave. They don't wear robes or carry torches. They don't parade through town squares or light bonfires. But make no mistake, the Inquisitors never disappeared. They just changed uniforms. And their targets aren't heretics screaming blasphemy from cathedral steps. They're whispers, hidden things, ancient forces that don't belong in the modern world, but somehow keep showing up anyway. The Vatican calls them the Custodes Umbrae, the keepers of the shadow. Officially, they don't exist. There's no office, no budget, no public record. But if a sealed box full of Egyptian charms washes up on a beach in Crete, or a scroll written in vanished hieroglyphs starts affecting everyone who reads it, these are the ones who get the call. Most of them are priests, but not the kind that give Sunday Mass. They're polyglots, fluent in forgotten tongues. They've memorized prayers that haven't been spoken in 1,000 years. Some trained in monasteries you won't find on any map. Others studied under desert mystics or Coptic elders who still trace their lineage back to Thoth's temples. They're not allowed to publish, not allowed to tell their families what they do, and they work under direct orders from a division even deeper than the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. When they travel, they don't wear collars, just plain clothes, but always with one item, a hidden relic, a charm, a sigil, something old, something protective, because what they investigate isn't safe. One file tells of a mission to a private library in rural France where a landowner claimed to have found a book that whispered. The team arrived quietly. No fanfare. 3 men, 2 women, all with theological training, and something else too. Something no one talks about. They retrieved the book, but one didn't return. The others said nothing. Just filed the report, marked it with the highest classification, and disappeared back into silence. The Church says these agents are protectors, that they keep dangerous knowledge out of the wrong hands. But others wonder if they're really just silencers, not stopping evil, just stopping questions. A rogue Jesuit once wrote that the custodes don't just seal away magical texts, they burn them. That some rituals are so close to unlocking forbidden truths, the Vatican would rather erase them entirely. Even stranger are the rumours that some agents begin to change, that working too long with these anomalies does something to them. One supposedly stopped aging, another went blind, but could still describe events happening miles away. None of these things are confirmed, but the files are full of redacted names, mission dates, and quiet warnings. In an age of satellites and digital archives, you'd think magic would be dead, that it would vanish under the weight of science, but it hasn't. It hides, slips through cracks, and the Vatican knows that, which is why the old systems were never shut down, just upgraded. Because in the end, it's not about belief, it's about control. And some spells, no matter how ancient, still work. It started as a footnote in a dusty file deep inside the Vatican archives. Category: anomalous healings. Most were obvious fakes, relics that glowed under candlelight, holy water that bubbled. But one case was different, not just because of the result, but because of who was watching. The year was 1974. A Jesuit medical observer stationed in Cairo was summoned to a rural monastery near Asyut. A local boy, no older than 8, had been declared terminal by every hospital he'd seen. His lungs were failing. No antibiotics worked. His family had given up. But then, something strange happened. An old monk, one no one had seen in years, brought out a scroll. It was wrapped in black cloth, sealed with a wax emblem that looked older than the monastery itself. The writing wasn't Arabic, not Coptic, not Greek. The symbols twisted like vines and pulsed under the candlelight. It was Egyptian, but not like anything they'd ever seen. The monk began to read. It took hours. His voice was calm but forceful. At certain points, he would stop and touch the boy's chest. The room felt heavy, like the walls were listening. And when it ended, the boy opened his eyes. He coughed once, then sat up. The fever was gone. His breathing was normal. Within a day, he was walking. The Jesuit observer documented everything. He took photographs, copied the symbols, recorded what parts of the chant he could remember. Then he sent it to Rome. That's when the real silence began. The scroll was taken. So was the monk. The monastery denied the event ever happened. The Jesuit was reassigned to a remote posting in Brazil, but not before he left a letter, hidden among his personal effects, found years later. In it, he described what he believed the spell did. Not just heal the body, but realign something deeper, like the sickness wasn't just physical, like it had been attached to the boy from somewhere else, somewhere not human. The Vatican's official report was brief. Unverified ritual of non-Christian origin. No further action recommended. But behind closed doors, that scroll became the subject of a restricted study. Only 3 people had clearance to read it. One of them was later hospitalized for hallucinations of radiant entities. Another left the priesthood and vanished. The third, he made a single note in the margins, the word still carries charge. Some say the spell worked because it tapped into something science can't measure, a force buried beneath the layers of time and translation. Others think it proves that language itself is a kind of technology, one we've long forgotten how to use. But the Vatican never burned the scroll. It's still in their vault, wrapped in black cloth, locked in a drawer, classified under relics of concern, not because they fear its power, but because they don't fully understand it. And that, to them, is far more dangerous. Because if one scroll could cure the incurable, what else have they hidden? And who decides what the world is allowed to remember? They found him kneeling in front of a shattered mirror. His hands were bleeding, his eyes were wide open but didn't blink. The only word he kept whispering was backward, over and over. Backward. This was 1954. The priest was Father Lucien Morelli. He'd been stationed at a small church in southern Italy. Nothing strange about him. Quiet, obedient, never questioned the doctrine. Until he did. He had come across an Egyptian scroll hidden in the church basement behind a false brick wall. It wasn't in any archive. It wasn't labelled, but it was clearly old and dangerous. The ink shimmered when the candlelight hit it, like it was trying to breathe. At first, he thought it was a prayer, a blessing for safe travel. But the more he studied it, the more he realised it wasn't about going anywhere. It was about seeing, not with your eyes, but with something else, something deeper. The instructions were simple. Light a candle, place a mirror on the wall, draw a circle around it, speak the words. But there was one warning, a single line written in red. Do not ask to see your own time. That's exactly what he did. What happened next wasn't written down in any Vatican report, but fragments survive, notes scribbled by the local bishop, witness accounts from the nuns, and a single letter written by a Vatican envoy who was sent to investigate. They say the room went completely still, the flame didn't flicker, the air pressed against the walls like it was trying to escape. Then the mirror went black, not like darkness, like void, like absence. Father Morelli spoke one sentence before the mirror shattered. They lied about the beginning. He was never the same after that. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He kept repeating things that made no sense, dates that didn't exist, names that had been erased from history, stories from places no one had ever heard of. He scratched symbols into the walls with his fingernails, symbols that matched the ones on the scroll. Eventually, they took him to a hospital in Rome. The Vatican sealed off the church, burned the scroll, or so they claimed. But the mirror was taken, not destroyed, locked in the Archivum Secretum, in a section marked Unusable Relics. And to this day, it's rumoured that if you look into that mirror for too long, something looks back, not a reflection, but a memory, one that doesn't belong to you. The Church officially denies the event ever happened, but inside the Vatican, there's a file labelled Speculum Right, still classified, still off limits, because seeing the future is dangerous. But seeing the truth behind time, that can drive even the faithful insane. They didn't call it magic, not at first. In the Vatican's private memos, it was referred to as auditory distortion phenomena, but everyone involved knew what it really was. A sound that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, a frequency buried in ancient Egyptian chants that didn't just echo through the air, it echoed through the mind. It started with a single wax cylinder recording pulled from a Jesuit collection in Alexandria. The label was written in Latin and simply said, "Do not play aloud." That warning came too late. The researcher who found it didn't read Latin. He played it. 2 minutes into the recording, he fainted. When he woke up, he claimed he saw his own body from above. He described colours that don't exist on the visible spectrum. He spoke in a language no one could recognise. The Vatican flew him to a secure clinic outside Rome and confiscated the cylinder. That cylinder now sits in a reinforced soundproof vault, but its contents have been duplicated, not on normal tape, not even digital. They used a proprietary Vatican tech lab to record it in magnetic fields, because any attempt to convert it into modern audio formats caused glitches, not software bugs. Electrical anomalies, devices overheated, lights flickered. One lab tech went deaf in both ears for 5 days. What was the chant saying? That's the part no one agrees on. Linguists identified fragments of Coptic and pre-dynastic Egyptian. The rhythm was hypnotic. The pitch vibrated slightly above 111 Hz. That number, for reasons still unknown, matches the frequency used in certain meditation rituals meant to simulate near-death experiences. In the right setting, it puts the brain in a state between dreaming and waking. In that state, suggestion becomes belief, and belief becomes reality, which is exactly what scared the church. Because once people realized that sound alone could change perception, memory, even belief itself, it undermined everything. No need for sermons, no need for scripture. Just one chant could make you feel closer to the divine than years of prayer. It bypassed doctrine, it bypassed control. So the Vatican shut it down, or tried to. But versions of the chant leaked quietly, through underground circles, through artists who didn't know what they were sampling, through recordings mislabeled as ambient soundscapes on forgotten websites. People who listened too long reported vivid dreams of Egyptian temples. Some said they floated outside their bodies. One claimed he heard a voice whisper, "This is how we remembered." Now, deep inside a Vatican-sponsored research facility, known only by its codename Aquila, priests and scientists work together. They don't pray, they listen, over and over, watching brain scans light up, measuring what cannot be explained, because somewhere in the ancient world, someone discovered a truth the church could never fully erase. That sound was more than vibration. It was a door, and it's starting to open again. They called it the language of heaven. Scholars of the early church described it as pure sound, uncorrupted by human tongues. But when linguists finally sat down with apocryphal texts, books rejected from the Bible, they noticed something strange. Words that didn't match Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic. Words that sounded older. Words that looked Egyptian. It wasn't just coincidence. Some of these so-called angelic names, phrases, and chants mirrored fragments found in temple walls from Karnak and Abydos. There were parallels in rhythm, structure, even the strange breathy syllables used in priestly invocations to gods like Thoth and Isis. Except now, they were being used to summon angels. In the Book of Enoch, an angel speaks a language no one can understand. But when that passage was run through phonetic comparison software, parts of it lined up with incantations recorded in 19th century transcriptions of Egyptian funerary spells, the kind used to guide a soul through the underworld. But here, they were being used to lift a soul into heaven. That's what worried the Vatican. Because if angelic language wasn't a gift from above, but rather a relic of an earlier earthly magic, then something about the entire chain of divine revelation fell apart. The idea that sacred words could be inherited from pagan priests didn't fit. So the overlaps were buried, dismissed as mistranslations. Or worse, labelled heretical. But the overlaps kept showing up. One chant, recorded in a 4th century Coptic gospel, now hidden deep in the Vatican archives, opens with a phrase nearly identical to a passage in the Egyptian Litany of the Eye. The chant invokes protection, vision beyond sight, and direct communion with beings of light. The church renamed them angels, but the Egyptians called them Neteru, divine intelligences, winged beings who moved between realms. Sound familiar? Even stranger were the drawings. Apocryphal scrolls preserved in Syrian monasteries showed beings descending on beams of light. Their wings weren't feathered. They were abstract, geometric, shaped like the symbols carved into Egyptian obelisks. Their names? Not Michael or Gabriel, but phonetic echoes of Ma'at and Horamachet. To the early church, this was dangerous ground. If angels and Egyptian gods shared traits, then maybe they came from the same origin. Maybe divine messengers were not unique to Christianity. Maybe they were part of a much older communication network, one rooted in vibration, geometry, and sound. Today, researchers in linguistic anthropology are beginning to revisit these patterns. Not in public, of course. Most of the funding comes from anonymous donors through religious universities, but behind closed doors they're matching phrases from ancient Egyptian temple rites to lost gospels. Sometimes the words line up perfectly. Sometimes the energy in the room changes when they're spoken aloud. Because what if angels didn't speak Hebrew or Latin? What if heaven had an older tongue? One spoken in temples, now buried under sand. One that once echoed through stone halls as priests called down light from the stars. One that never disappeared, just changed form, waiting for someone to listen. His name was barely mentioned in sermons, just a footnote in older hagiographies. But to those who studied the strange edge between Christian miracles and forbidden rites, he stood out. Saint Cyrianus, canonized in the 12th century, revered in quiet corners of Spain and North Africa, and now, according to one leaked Vatican memo, under review, because his miracles didn't look like the others. No loaves multiplying, no blind men suddenly seeing. Instead, his powers seemed ritualistic. Recorded accounts describe him drawing symbols in the dirt before healing the sick, chanting in a tongue that monks refused to translate. One letter from a frightened bishop said the saint would whisper into water and have the dying drink it. Their fevers broke, their wounds closed. But the words he used? Not Latin, not Greek. According to one scholar who secretly examined his old texts, they were almost entirely Egyptian. Specifically, from the temple of Kom Ombo. It gets stranger. Hidden in the margins of one preserved manuscript is a tiny drawing of an ankh, the Egyptian symbol for life. Below it, a note in Latin. He used this to speak to the dead. Other scribes tried to erase the line, but it's still there, faintly visible under the smudges. A modern spectral analysis confirmed the ink is from the same time period, which means someone inside the church knew what he was doing and tried to cover it up. The Vatican had a choice. Admit they canonized a man who practiced what was essentially magic, or rewrite his story. So they rewrote it. His Egyptian chants were relabeled ecstatic prayer. His spell circles became symbols of divine focus. The water ritual, now explained as holy blessing. But in older versions of the same tales, the truth leaks through. Eyewitnesses said he carried a pouch of herbs from Alexandria, that he spoke of calling down fire from the sky through the names of the old gods. His cloak was embroidered with stars and serpents, not crosses. Some said he studied in Egypt before joining the church. Others whispered he was already a priest of Thoth before he ever heard the name of Christ. Either way, his fusion of traditions worked. People were healed. Storms were calmed. And for a while, Rome tolerated it, because results spoke louder than rules. But now, with digital access to ancient manuscripts growing and forbidden texts being quietly translated, his story is drawing attention again. The Vatican has reportedly begun a re-evaluation of his sainthood. They fear that if people connect the dots, they'll realize his miracles weren't miracles at all. They were spells, Egyptian ones. And if one saint used them, how many others did too? Maybe the line between miracle and magic was never that clear. Maybe it was never meant to be. It was kept in a sealed display case, buried deep in the restricted archives of the Vatican Ethnological Museum. No signs. No documentation open to the public. Just a faint hum behind thick glass and something the archivists had no name for. A black stone tablet no bigger than a dinner plate, carved with strange symbols that looked suspiciously Egyptian. But this was no ordinary relic, because late at night, when the lights were off, the glyphs glowed. Not like paint or chemicals. Not like anything man-made. The light was soft and golden, like candlelight trapped under the surface of the stone. And according to a 1973 security report, never meant to be released, it pulsed in rhythm with nearby voices, especially during prayer. That's when someone finally checked the carvings. A scholar brought in under strict silence compared the glowing glyphs to pages from the Book of the Dead. His conclusion? They weren't just similar, they were exact matches, line for line, stroke for stroke. Even the damaged corners of the glyphs matched torn sections of a papyrus found in Thebes centuries earlier. The Vatican didn't deny it. They just classified the report and reassigned the scholar. He never published again. What makes this more terrifying is what the Book of the Dead actually is. It's not a storybook. It's a manual, a guide to the afterlife, full of spells and instructions for the soul's journey through death. The glowing tablet didn't just have pictures. It had directions. Lines that translated to things like, "Speak and the gate will open," and "Name the stars and become light." These weren't metaphors. The Vatican suspected they were activations. But of what? There are unconfirmed reports from the 1,980s of scientists from the Pontifical Academy being brought in to test the artifact. The lead physicist, a man known for debunking miracles, resigned a month later. His personal notes, leaked by a colleague, mention non-thermal luminescence without energy source and coherent glyph array possibly reactive to thought patterns. That last line was crossed out in red ink. The Vatican tightened access shortly after. Only 2 cardinals have clearance to view the object now. The stone itself has been moved 3 times in the past 10 years. But a former custodian who worked 1 floor below the chamber said sometimes, in the middle of the night, the lights would flicker and a golden glow would leak through the cracks in the floorboards. He never went back. Theories range from alien technology to lost Atlantean relics. But the truth might be simpler. The ancient Egyptians believed words had power, that symbols carved with divine intent could hold the essence of gods. Maybe this tablet isn't a relic. Maybe it's still active, still listening. And maybe that's why the church keeps it locked away. Because if it responds to prayer, who exactly is it answering? They called it a scheduled inspection, a routine maintenance task. But nothing about what happened that day in 1972 was routine. The vault in question hadn't been touched in over 400 years. Its lock was older than most countries. Its seal carried the mark of a pope whose name had been quietly erased from official records. No one even remembered what was inside, only that it was never supposed to be opened. But they did it anyway. At precisely 11:40, 2 a.m., deep beneath Vatican City, a team of 6 was granted entry. 3 guards, 2 scholars, and 1 priest. The door itself was lead-lined and carved with unfamiliar symbols. Not Latin, not Greek, something older. They broke the wax seal, inserted a specialized key, and turned. The door opened. No one is sure what happened next. The security logs cut out for exactly 12 minutes. When the cameras came back online, the hallway was empty. No sign of the team, no signs of struggle. Just an open door and absolute silence. Then one of the guards stumbled out. He didn't speak. Not at first, he just cried. His clothes were torn and scorched, like he'd been near a blast. But there was no fire, no smoke. The Vatican medics said his vitals were normal, except for one thing. His pupils were shaped like stars, perfect 5-pointed stars. He was sedated and transferred to a private facility. He died 3 days later, but not from injuries, from thirst. The doctors said he refused to drink anything that wasn't blessed. The rest of the team was never found. Inside the vault, there were no relics, no scrolls, just dust. At first. But one of the guards who had reviewed the footage reported seeing shadows on the wall, moving in ways that didn't match the lighting, like something had stepped through the doorway and then stepped out. By 5 p.m, the vault had been resealed. Permanently. A new papal decree was issued that same afternoon. It was handwritten and signed under emergency protocol. The decree cited a breach in containment of sacred silence and ordered the area exercised every 40 days. To this day, the hallway is off limits. Cameras were removed, motion sensors disabled, and a new inscription was carved into the stone above the vault. It's written in Coptic. Roughly translated, it reads, "Here ends the voice of the old gods." Whispers from insiders suggest the church believes something got out, not a person, not a thing, a presence, one that had been trapped for centuries. Some call it a fragment of an ancient consciousness, others call it a curse. Either way, something crossed a line, and now that line is blurred. To most people, the vault was just a story, but for the men who opened it, even for just 12 minutes, it became something else entirely. A warning. Some doors are locked for a reason. It always starts the same way. A missing manuscript, a whispered chant, a candle lit in the wrong chapel, at the wrong hour. No one announces they're trying to make contact. They just vanish into the archives, slip into locked rooms, memorize half-forgotten phrases written in ink that fades under sunlight. And then something happens. The Vatican doesn't officially acknowledge it, but buried in classified incident reports are patterns, repeating symbols, anomalies logged but never explained. In 1983, a monk from a French monastery was found unconscious beneath the crypt. Around him were ash circles, drawn in soot from burned incense, not used since the 5th century. He had written a word on the stone floor. It wasn't Latin, it wasn't Greek, but it matched a glyph from a banned Egyptian scroll last seen in a private Jesuit collection. He woke up 3 days later, and he didn't remember anything, except for one sentence he repeated over and over. He spoke through the flame. No one knew what he meant. But it wasn't the last time that phrase appeared. In 1997, a rogue group calling themselves the Sons of the Dawn was caught breaking into a sealed section of the Vatican's secret library. Inside their bags were ritual tools from 3 different ancient traditions: Coptic chants, Egyptian scarabs, and something wrapped in linen, soaked in myrrh. A bone, human, but unusually light, as if hollowed out. They weren't just researching, they were reenacting something. One of them confessed, said they weren't the first, claimed they were following instructions left behind in code by a 17th century monk who claimed to have spoken with the original light, not a metaphor, a real presence. He said they were trying to bridge the gap between this world and what he called the Deep Temple, a plane of truth buried beneath time. They believed Egyptian ritual magic wasn't superstition. It was a science, a way to reach across dimensions. Contact. But something always goes wrong. Every one of those attempts ends in silence. Memory loss, illness, madness, or worse. The Vatican doesn't prosecute, they cover it, they move the bodies, they burn the pages, and they revise the records. Still, the attempts keep happening. In the hills of Italy, a small group of monks was expelled after building a hidden underground chapel. On the walls, they had painted stars aligned in the ancient Egyptian calendar. At the centre was a symbol of a mouth surrounded by flames. The same symbol found in spells, meant to awaken the soul after death. Why keep trying? Because some believe the veil is thinner now. That time has begun to fold. That the chants and spells that once opened doors between the worlds might work again if spoken at the right hour, in the right place. And some are no longer asking permission. They aren't just trying to contact something, they're trying to bring it back. It started online, a few cryptic posts, then TikToks with glowing ankhs, chants over lo-fi beats, and kids talking about Thoth like he was trending. At first, no one paid attention. Just another niche internet phase, but it didn't fade. It grew, quietly, organically. And suddenly, a generation that was supposed to be forgetting history was reviving one far older than the church wanted remembered. They called it Kemetism, a return to the ways of Kemet, the true name of ancient Egypt. Not just pyramids and mummies, but the old gods, the sacred symbols, the spells buried in tombs and hidden in museum basements. But this wasn't cosplay. They were serious. They were reading translations of the pyramid texts, studying lunar cycles, decoding star maps. Some even claimed dreams where Egyptian deities spoke in voices older than language. Alongside it came Hermeticism. Teachings once whispered in secret chambers were now posted in Discord threads and annotated on Instagram stories. The Emerald Tablet, the Kybalion, the idea that everything is connected, that thought shapes reality, that the gods are not above us, but within us. Teenagers quoting Hermes Trismegistus instead of influencers, talking about ascension, inner alchemy, memory recovery. The Vatican noticed. It always does when the past refuses to stay buried, especially when that past threatens the one narrative they've spent centuries protecting. Because if Egyptian spiritual systems start to make sense again, if young minds begin to see Christianity not as a divine endpoint, but as a remix of something older, the foundations begin to crack. A leaked document from a Vatican cultural observatory flagged the trend as theological destabilization. They weren't worried about actual magic, they were worried about questions. Why do so many Bible stories echo Egyptian myths? Why are saints described like gods? Why do early Christian texts hide traces of the very practices the Church condemned? There's a deeper fear that what's rising isn't just curiosity, it's memory, collective, genetic, that something is waking up inside people, an echo of forgotten rituals, a pull toward temples that no longer stand, toward languages we were taught not to hear. In some circles, the revival has already gone beyond study, candlelit ceremonies, spoken invocations, meditations guided by ancient symbols. They say when done properly, the air changes, that you feel seen, not by people, by something else, something old. This is not about rebellion, it's not even about belief. It's about recognition, a feeling that the official story isn't complete, that there's something we left behind in the sands, something that was taken from us, and that calling it back might change everything. The Church has always feared the return of Egypt, not the country, the idea, the knowledge, the magic, because once it rises again, it doesn't just challenge doctrine, it burns away the illusion that history is linear, that truth belongs to the present. And maybe that's what this new Egypt is, not a place, a memory, one that refuses to stay buried. It was supposed to be just another Sunday. St. Peter's Basilica was full. Tourists packed into the back. Locals lined the pews. Cameras were live. The choir had just finished a hymn. Then the priest stepped up to the altar to begin the liturgy. But what came out of his mouth wasn't Latin. It wasn't Italian either. At first it sounded like a slip, a strange syllable, then another. The tone shifted. Something in the air got heavier. People stopped fanning themselves. Some turned to each other, confused. The sound didn't make sense, but it made something feel. Then the microphones cut out, all of them, simultaneously. Not a pop, not feedback, just silence. And yet his voice continued, no amplification, but still somehow loud, still echoing. A slow rhythmic chant, like it was rising from the stone itself. A few people reported hearing ringing in their ears. Others said they felt like they couldn't breathe. Some swore the candles along the aisle flickered against the draught. Others said the light bent. No one moved. A woman fainted near the front. A child started crying. One of the camera operators said later that the feed didn't just go black, it froze on one frame. The priest's mouth wide open, eyes completely white. After about a minute, he stopped, looked out over the crowd like nothing had happened, continued the Mass in perfect Latin, calm, measured. But the mood never returned to normal. When it ended, Vatican security escorted him out through a side door. He didn't speak to anyone. The footage never aired. The Vatican press office said there had been a minor technical fault. But every technician on site said nothing was wrong with the equipment. The servers logged no error. The backup audio was erased. Someone deleted it manually. A week later, the priest was reassigned, somewhere remote, no announcement, no explanation. And the basilica staff were told not to speak about the incident again, but rumours spread anyway. One sacristan claimed the chant sounded like Coptic. Another swore he recognised a word from a text he'd seen once during a Jesuit training seminar, a word tied to a resurrection spell. Others whispered about an Egyptian papyrus stored beneath the Vatican library, a scroll supposedly capable of invoking divine presence through sound. Scholars had dismissed it, until now. Some believe the priest never meant to say those words, that something moved through him. Others think he found the scroll, memorized it, chanted it on purpose, a test, or maybe a message. No one can agree on what really happened that day, only that everyone who was there felt it. A sound too old to have a name. Something forgotten by time, but not by stone. The Vatican never issued a second statement. The tapes are still missing, and the priest has never been seen again. It was never about turning sand into gold, or summoning storms with a whisper. Egyptian magic was something deeper. It was memory, intention, a way of shaping the world by understanding your place in it. Every spell was a reminder that the gods were not somewhere above watching, they were inside you, speaking through your breath, moving with your hands. That kind of power terrifies those who need control to survive. The ancient priests didn't just chant words, they activated something. They believed that names had power, that knowing the true name of a thing meant you could shape its destiny. And the church knew this. Not just feared it, but studied it, quietly, secretly, while telling the rest of the world it was dangerous, evil, heresy, because the truth behind Egyptian magic wasn't chaos. It wasn't even rebellion, it was independence, the kind that can't be ruled. If you could speak to the divine yourself, what use would you have for a priest? If you could protect your soul with your own voice, who needs a saviour? That question has echoed for centuries, and that is why they buried the scrolls, why they burned the names, why they rewrote the past in Latin, and erased the papyri written in stars and breath and silence. Freedom isn't just a political word. In Egypt, it meant you were unbound. Your soul could travel beyond death. Your mind could hold light. You could become something more than flesh, more than what others said you had to be. And that scared them more than any demon. Even today, you can still feel the tension. Why do modern researchers get denied access to the oldest texts? Why are certain artifacts still kept locked away behind stone and steel? Because deep down, they know those ideas still live. Not in spells, but in the questions they raise. The uncomfortable kind. The ones that tear at the roots of control. What if the divine is not above you, but inside you? What if the words you speak carry more than just sound? What if you were never meant to be kept small? This is why the church feared Egypt. Not because of its curses, but because of its clarity. Not because it was dark, but because it knew how to hold light. They feared the idea that truth didn't need permission. That wisdom could come from silence. That memory could survive even the burning of libraries. Egyptian magic was a blueprint, not just for ritual, but for awakening, for recognizing that the universe listens, that symbols are alive, that your thoughts are a kind of spell and your choices ripple through time. You cannot control a people who remember what they are, so the best way to rule them is to make them forget. But memory has a way of returning, and when it does, even the darkest vault cannot hold it. Not forever.